Kyoto was bipartisan. In 1997, the Senate voted 95-0 to pass the Byrd-Hagel resolution, stating that the United States should not be a signatory to a treaty that does not include binding targets for developing nations or that would result in serious harm to the economy. Because Kyoto failed on both counts, President Clinton never submitted the treaty to the Senate for ratification. Kyoto's principal failure was its lack of inclusiveness. By only requiring commitments from developed countries, Kyoto does not place restrictions on a majority of countries, including 3 of the world's 5 largest emitters, China, India, and Brazil. A treaty cannot reduce emissions without their participation. Even Al Gore conceded that binding commitments from developing countries are essential. But I was the only member of the House to attend the UN climate conference in Poznan last December, and negotiations are not headed in that direction. I met with delegations from both China and India, and I asked, point blank, will you agree to mandatory emissions cuts? Both countries said no. The emissions in the developing world are rising so rapidly that reductions from developed countries will be entirely offset by countries without binding commitments. The Battelle Memorial Institute recently calculated that, based on business-as-usual projections, developing countries will produce more emissions than developed countries within the next 10 years. And there is a graphic over there that demonstrates that fact. A recent article in Foreign Affairs magazine quantified China's growth. By 2050, China is expected to have more cars than the United States. China's grand-scale urbanization plan will aggravate matters. China's leaders plan to relocate 400 million people to newly developed urban centers between 2000 and 2030. In the process, they will erect half of all the buildings expected to be constructed in the world during that period. That is a troubling prospect, considering the Chinese buildings are not energy efficient. In fact, they are roughly 2.5 times less so than those in Germany. Rather than accept mandatory limits or increase its efficiency, China and other developing countries hope to sell offsets to the developed world. Accepting foreign investment is hardly a sacrifice comparable to binding limits on emissions. But beyond the unfairness, there's no way to guarantee that the offsets will actually happen. The theory is sound. Instead of limiting emissions where they're the most costly, companies can make the same cuts for less money abroad. The problems, however, are twofold. First, the money should be invested in our own economy as sent to China. And second, many of the offsets won't happen. A recent project demonstration demonstrates the problem. Germany recently agreed to purchase offset credits from Chinese developers to build a new dam. The UN approved more than 16 million credits for the project. This legitimizes 16 million tons of emissions in Germany and generates tens of millions of dollars of revenue for China. The problem, beyond the massive transfer of wealth, is that developers began constructing the dam 2 years before applying for the credits. According to the British Times Online, one UN official estimated that 20% of the carbon credits failed to result in actual reductions. Karen Harbert, the president and CEO of the Institute for 21st Century Energy, will testify that the 2007 UN negotiations in Bali, Indonesia, produced positive steps towards a new treaty. In Bali, developing countries agreed to actions that were measurable, reportable, and verifiable. This fits with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities that I support and that is fundamental in these negotiations. An agreement to handicap a handful of economies won't change economic realities. Consumers will still buy goods, the manufacture of these goods will result in the same emissions, and America will simply outsource more emissions and more jobs. Every country has the right and every government has the obligation to pull its citizens from poverty and advance their way of life. The current global downturn starkly demonstrates that wealth isn't a fixed pie. It can increase and decrease in absolute terms, and American prosperity doesn't come at the expense of the world. The entire economic world can grow, but all that growth must be subject to the same limitations. We cannot self-impose costs while foreign markets grow freely. The result is too predictable. A long-term contraction of the U.S. economy coupled with the continued explosion of global markets. In the face of intense pressure to find a solution, we can't adopt a costly one that won't work. And I thank the Chair.
Great. The gentleman's time has expired. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington State, Mr. Inslee.